The FBI director, staring down the barrel of a cop's gun, targeted for his skin. Hours later, the officer is jailed, but the incident unleashes a firestorm if the nation's top lawman faces this. What hope remains for anyone else against systemic rot? The late afternoon sun casts long shadows across the asphalt as the unmarked black sedan moves smoothly through the city's western district. At the wheel, FBI Director Jamal Caden Washington kept a steady pace with the flow of traffic, his gaze occasionally sweeping the rearview mirror by ingrained habit rather than immediate concern. Beside him, Special Agent David Miller, younger, with keen eyes that missed little, was reviewing notes on a tablet, a briefing for their upcoming community outreach meeting. It was a routine end to a day of otherwise high-stakes discussions and strategic planning at the local field office. Director Washington had specifically chosen to ride with Miller in a standard bureau vehicle, foregoing his usual security detail for this leg of the trip. Aiming for a degree of unobtrusiveness, the sudden flash of red and blue lights erupting behind them was an unwelcome surprise. Miller looked up sharply. "What's this about?" Washington's expression tightened almost imperceptibly. He checked his speed. It was well within the limit. "No idea. Pulling us over." He signaled and guided the sedan to the curb, the engine's hum dying down to a quiet stillness that felt instantly charged. A uniformed officer was approaching from the police cruiser, now parked a car length behind. Officer Craig Hensley, a man whose 15 years on the force had etched lines of cynicism and a hardened set to his jaw, moved with a deliberate, almost swaggering gait. His hand rested near his holstered weapon, a posture that radiated an immediate sense of confrontation. Washington lowered his window, his hands placed visibly on the steering wheel. "Good afternoon, officer. Is there a problem?" His voice was calm, measured, the tone he used to diffuse tense negotiations. Hensley's eyes, cold and assessing, scanned Washington first, then Miller. He ignored the director's question. "License and registration, and you." He jabbed a thumb towards Miller. "Your ID, too." His voice was gravelly, laced with an unmistakable edge of hostility. "Certainly, officer." Washington replied, reaching slowly for his wallet. Agent Miller mirrored his careful movements, retrieving his federal identification, as Washington presented his driver's license alongside his official FBI credentials, clearly identifying him as the director of the Federal Bureau of Investigation. Hensley barely glanced at them. His focus remained fixed on Washington's face, a flicker of something ugly, disdain, suspicion, crossing his features. He took the documents, his thumb deliberately obscuring Washington's photograph on the FBI ID as he pretended to scrutinize the driver's license. "This vehicle registered to you, sir," Hensley drawled, his use of "sir" a mockery. "It's an official government vehicle," Washington stated, his patience beginning to fray at the officer's blatant unprofessionalism. "As you can see from my credentials, I am Director Washington of the FBI, and this is Special Agent Miller." Hensley smirked. "FBI, huh, big important man. What's a big important man like you doing in this part of town?" His eyes raked over Washington's dark suit, then met his gaze with undisguised contempt. The implication was clear, the racial undertone hanging heavy in the air. "Officer, my reasons for being here are official FBI business," Washington said, his voice now carrying a note of command. "Is there a specific violation you pulled us over for? Or are we free to go?" "You're free to go when I say you're free to go." Hensley snapped, his face reddening. "Step out of the vehicle. Both of you. Hands where I can see them." A cold knot tightened in Washington's stomach. This was escalating far beyond any reasonable traffic stop. This was targeted. This was abuse of power. Ganby Miller shot a concerned look at Washington, his hand instinctively moving toward his own service weapon. But Washington gave a minute, almost imperceptible shake of his head. Escalation from their side would only feed Hensley's aggression. "Officer, this is highly irregular," Washington said, his voice dangerously low. "I am the director of the FBI. I suggest you reconsider your actions." Hensley laughed, a harsh, grating sound. Irregular, I'll tell you what's irregular. You, in this car, in this neighborhood. Now out, or I'll drag you out. With a deep, controlled breath, Washington opened his door and stepped out, followed by Miller. They stood by the sedan, hands raised slightly in a non-threatening gesture. Passers-by on the sidewalk were beginning to slow, their faces curious, some already pulling out phones. The public humiliation was beginning, swift and sharp. Against the car. Spread 'em, Hensley barked, his attention solely on Washington. He completely ignored Agent Miller for the moment. His focus was on the black man who dared to question his authority, who dared to exist in a suit and a government car in his city. As Washington turned to comply, placing his hands on the roof of the sedan, Hensley suddenly moved with alarming speed. Before Washington or Miller could fully process the shift, Hensley had unholstered his firearm, the metallic click echoing unnaturally loud in the urban soundscape. He pressed the cold muzzle of the gun firmly against the back of Jamal Washington's head. I said, spread him. You think I'm playing? Hensley snarled, his voice a venomous whisper close to Washington's ear. The world narrowed to the chilling pressure of steel against his skull, the acrid scent of gun oil, and the officer's ragged breathing. Years of training, of facing down armed criminals and terrorists, hadn't prepared him for this. To be at the mercy of a rogue cop on a city street, his life hanging by the thinnest of threads because of the color of his skin. Agent Miller, seeing the gun to his director's head, finally broke protocol. Officer, stand down. He is the director of the FBI. You are making a catastrophic mistake. Miller's voice was urgent, his own weapon now partially drawn, his stance shifting into a combat-ready position, though he was careful not to aim directly at Hensley yet, seeking de-escalation even now. He was also subtly angling his body to shield his other hand as he activated his emergency beacon and a covert audio recording on his service phone. Hensley, startled by Miller's sudden movement and declaration, seemed to momentarily consider his options. He pressed the gun harder against Washington's head. You reach for that weapon. Fed, and your boss gets it first. Don't think I won't. His eyes darted between Miller and the growing number of onlookers. A trapped, furious animal. The shame was not his, it was Washington's, for being in this position, for being the target. Time seemed to distort. Washington remained perfectly still, the cold metal a stark reminder of his vulnerability. The humiliation was a burning fire within him, but survival was paramount. He could hear the distant wail of sirens, growing closer. Miller must have signaled. Or perhaps the onlookers, witnessing an officer holding a man at gunpoint, had called it in. The approaching siren seemed to pierce through Hensley's rage-fueled haze. His eyes widened slightly. He looked at Washington again, then at Miller, then at the faces in the crowd. For the first time, a flicker of uncertainty, perhaps even fear, crossed his face. He'd gone too far. The realization was dawning, not of the racial injustice, but of the potential repercussions for himself. He abruptly pulled the gun away, though he didn't reholster it immediately. All right, he muttered, more to himself than to anyone else. Taking a clumsy step back, the immediate, lethal threat had passed, but the air remained thick with tension. The image of the gun to the FBI director's head seared into the minds of everyone present and into the memory of Miller's recording devices. The sirens were very close now. Several police cars, lights blazing, screeched to a halt around them, boxing in the scene. Uniformed officers began to emerge, their expressions initially set for a high-risk situation, now morphing into confusion as they took in the sight of Officer Hensley, Agent Miller, and the distinguished, now visibly furious, man standing by the sedan, a man Hensley had just held at gunpoint. One of the first officers on the scene, a sergeant, recognized Agent Miller from previous interagency briefings. His eyes widened as he approached, his gaze shifting to the highest-ranking law enforcement officer in the country, who was now straightening his suit, his face a mask of cold fury. The humiliation was complete. The attack witnessed, the lines drawn. The immediate aftermath was about to begin. The tableau on the city street was one of stunned disbelief transforming into frantic, controlled action. The newly arrived officers, led by a sharp-eyed Sergeant Miles Corbin, quickly assessed the unbelievable scene. Officer Craig Hensley, still armed but now looking pale and cornered. Special Agent David Miller, radiating federal authority and fury, and the towering figure of FBI Director Jamal K. Washington, whose composure was a thin veneer over a core of incandescent rage. The crowd of onlookers, phones still held aloft, buzzed with a mixture of shock and morbid fascination. Sergeant Corbin, who had worked joint task forces with the FBI, recognized Agent Miller instantly. His gaze then shifted to Washington, and a sickening wave of comprehension washed over him. He'd seen the director's face on official bulletins and news reports. Director Washington, Agent Miller, what in God's name happened here? Corbin demanded, his voice tight. Miller stepped forward, his own service weapon now safely holstered, but his hand never far from it. Sergeant, your officer, Hensley, conducted an unwarranted, racially motivated traffic stop. He then proceeded to assault Director Washington. Holding him at gunpoint, I have audio and video. Miller's words were clipped, each one landing like a hammer blow. He gestured to his phone, which was still discreetly recording. Hensley started to bluster. They were acting suspiciously. I had reasonable. Silence, Hensley, Corbin barked, cutting him off. He turned to two of his officers. Secure Officer Hensley's weapon. Cuff him. The click of handcuffs ratcheting shut around Hensley's wrists was a definitive sound, cutting through the lingering tension. The officer who had moments before wielded absolute, terrifying power over the nation's top law enforcement official was now being disarmed and restrained by his own colleagues. His face, a mixture of disbelief and dawning horror, was a study in consequence. He looked wildly from Corbin to Washington, sputtering. You can't. I'm a police officer. I was doing my job. Your job is not to put a gun to the head of an unarmed man, especially not the director of the FBI, Corbin retorted, his disgust palpable. You're under arrest for aggravated assault with a deadly weapon, and official misconduct. You have the right to remain silent. As Hensley was being read his Miranda rights and led, struggling and shouting, towards a police cruiser, a black SUV with flashing lights pulled up. The city police chief, Marcus Thorne, a man Washington knew by reputation and had met on a few occasions, emerged. He was a stern, imposing figure, and his expression was grim. He had clearly been alerted en route to the identities of those involved. He walked directly to Washington, his eyes filled with a mixture of apology and outrage. Director Washington, on behalf of the entire department, I am appalled. There are no words. Are you harmed? Chief Thorne's voice was low, but carried the weight of his office physically. No, Chief Thorne, but this. Washington gestured to the scene, the crowd, the now subdued Hensley being placed in a squad car. This is an outrage that goes far beyond me. His voice was steady, but the tremor of fury was unmistakable. He will be prosecuted to the fullest extent of the law. I give you my word. Thorne stated, meeting Washington's gaze. We will cooperate fully with your office in the Department of Justice. He then turned to oversee the processing of the scene, ensuring Agent Miller's evidence was formally noted and secured. The swiftness of Hensley's arrest was almost unprecedented, a direct result of the victim's identity and the undeniable public nature of the assault. Less than 30 minutes had passed since the initial stop. Escorted by Agent Miller and with Chief Thorne's personal assurance of immediate action, Washington was driven away, not back to his intended community meeting, but to a secure federal facility. The adrenaline that had sharpened his senses during the confrontation began to recede, leaving behind a bone-deep weariness and a familiar, bitter ache. It wasn't just the shock of the gun against his skin or the public humiliation. It was the echo of a past he thought he had relegated to the annals of his memory, a past that had forged his resilience but had also left indelible scars. As the cityscape blurred past the tinted windows, Jamal Washington found his mind drifting back over 30 years. To a humid summer night in his old neighborhood. He was 19, a promising college student, home for the holidays. He'd been driving his father's aging but well-maintained sedan, returning from his part-time job at a local library. He was full of dreams then, of law school, of making a difference. He remembered the flashing lights in his rearview mirror, the same sudden, jarring intrusion. Two officers, white, their faces illuminated by the harsh glow of their flashlight beams, approached his car. He remembered the immediate assumption of guilt in their eyes, the way they spoke to him, not as a citizen, but as a suspect. "Where are you coming from, boy?" one of them had sneered, the word boy a deliberate, demeaning barb. "From my job at the library, sir. I'm just heading home." Jamal had replied, his voice respectful, though fear was a cold serpent coiling in his stomach. He'd been taught by his father, a man who had endured far worse in the Jim Crow South, how to survive such encounters. Be polite, be compliant, don't argue, don't give them any excuse. They'd pulled him out of the car, just as Hensley had. They'd searched him, roughly, their hands lingering, their questions invasive, laced with accusations. "Whose car is this? Got any drugs in here, weapons?" He had no drugs, no weapons. The car was his father's, he told them, his voice trembling slightly despite his efforts to remain calm. They made him stand on the sidewalk, illuminated by their headlights, while they tore through the car, scattering his textbooks, his father's neatly organized glove compartment, onto the seats and floor. They found nothing, but they weren't done. One of the officers, the older, meaner one, had shoved him against the car, his face inches from Jamal's. "You think you're smart, college boy. You think you're better than us." The officer's breath was sour with coffee and malice. "Around here, you're just another nigger who doesn't know his place." The slur had hit him with physical force, stealing his breath, igniting a rage so profound it almost choked him. But he remembered his father's warnings, the stories of what happened to young black men who fought back, who showed their anger. He remembered the fear in his mother's eyes every time he left the house. So he had endured. He had swallowed the humiliation, the injustice, the burning hatred. He had remained silent, his fists clenched at his sides, his jaw tight, until they finally, reluctantly, let him go with a vague, unsubstantiated warning to stay out of trouble. He had driven home that night, the interior of his father's car a wreck, his spirit bruised almost beyond repair. He hadn't told his parents the worst of it, just that he'd been stopped. He didn't want to burden them further, but the incident had solidified something within him. It wasn't a desire for revenge, but a burning, unyielding resolve to change the system from within. It was why he pursued law, why he joined the FBI, why he had dedicated his life to upholding the very principles those officers had so casually, so cruelly violated. His silence then, and his initial controlled reaction with Hensley, were born of that painful formative experience. It was the ingrained survival instinct of a black man in America, an instinct that even the directorship of the FBI could not entirely erase. It was a strategy of de-escalation, a way to stay alive in the face of irrational, armed bigotry. Enduring the indignity was a bitter pill, but it was often the price of survival, the price of being able to fight it another day, on a larger stage, for more systemic change. The cold steel of Hensley's gun against his head had been a visceral, terrifying reminder that despite his rank, his power, his decades of service, to some, he would always be seen first through the distorted lens of race. The humiliation today was different only in its public scale and the rank of its victim. The underlying poison was the same. The painful past wasn't just a memory, it was a continuous, living reality for so many. And Jamal Washington, now more than ever, felt the weight of that reality and the fierce rekindled fire of his lifelong commitment to ensure that one day, Such stories would only be found in history books, not lived on city streets. The fight was far from over. In fact, for him, it had just taken on a new, deeply personal, and very public dimension. The day after the assault, Jamal Washington was back in his Washington, D.C. headquarters. The sterile, secure environment, a stark contrast to the chaotic vulnerability he'd experienced on that city street. He had declined medical leave, his insistence on returning to work a silent testament to his resilience and his refusal to be visibly broken by the encounter. His suit was immaculate, his demeanor composed, but a new, harder glint resided in his eyes. The incident had already exploded in the national media. Agent Miller's crystal-clear audio and the multiple cell phone videos from bystanders had gone viral, painting an undeniable picture of Officer Hensley's aggression and racial animus. Washington convened an emergency meeting with his senior staff. The mood in the room was a mixture of barely suppressed fury on his behalf and grave concern for the Bureau's image and the wider implications. "What happened to me," Washington began, his voice resonating with controlled power, "is not an isolated incident. It is a symptom of a deeper malaise that affects too many citizens in this country. While the swift arrest of Officer Hensley is a step toward accountability, it is not, by itself, justice." He outlined his intentions, full cooperation with the Department of Justice's Civil Rights Division, which had already opened an investigation into Hensley and his department, and a renewed internal push within the FBI to improve training on de-escalation and implicit bias, not just for their agents, but to be offered as a model for state and local law enforcement. He also prepared for a press conference, knowing the nation awaited his words. However, the path forward, which seemed so clear in its moral imperatives, quickly became obstructed by insidious undercurrents. The initial wave of public outrage and support for Washington was almost immediately met with a carefully orchestrated counter-narrative. A powerful police union, representing Hensley, issued a statement decrying the rush to judgment against a veteran officer and vaguely alluding to stressors and the dangers of the job. Pro-police blogs and certain media commentators began to spin a different tale. Was the FBI director perhaps arrogant? Did he fail to comply adequately? Was his presence in that particular neighborhood truly benign? The questions were couched in deniability, but aimed to sow doubt, to subtly shift blame. Chief Marcus Thorne, who had seemed so resolute at the scene, found himself embattled. He received an avalanche of hate mail and veiled threats. His own rank and file were divided, with a vocal minority, amplified by the union, viewing Hensley as a scapegoat and Thorne's quick condemnation as a betrayal. The city council, too, began to feel the pressure, with some members wary of alienating the police union or a segment of their voters, starting to make noises about due process for all in a tone that suggested Hensley was the one being wronged. Washington felt the systemic resistance in subtle but chilling ways. During a briefing with a high-ranking Department of Justice official, the official, while outwardly supportive, gently suggested that Washington might consider a less prominent role in the public discussion to avoid personalizing the issue and potentially inflaming tensions further. The implication was clear: Washington, the victim of a blatant racial attack, was himself becoming a political inconvenience. His very existence as a powerful black man demanding accountability was seen as provocative by those invested in maintaining the status quo. Then came the legal maneuvering. Hensley's newly appointed defense attorney, a notoriously aggressive lawyer known for defending controversial police officers, filed a motion to suppress Agent Miller's recording, claiming it was an illegal wiretap made without Hensley's consent. He simultaneously filed a civil suit against Director Washington and Agent Miller for defamation and emotional distress, a preposterous claim, yet one designed to muddy the waters, to create a smokescreen of counter-accusations. The strategy was clear: attack the credibility of the victim and the evidence, and play for time, hoping public interest would wane. Washington watched these developments with a growing sense of grim familiarity. This was the system he knew, the one he had fought to navigate and reform his entire career. It was a system that often protected its own, that resisted change. That could take a clear-cut case of abuse and twist it into a pretzel of legalistic obfuscation and character assassination. The covert discrimination wasn't just the whispers and the victim blaming. It was the way the gears of the justice system itself could be manipulated to protect the powerful and silence the marginalized. Even when the marginalized was, ironically, the director of the FBI. The most galling moment came during a background check for a routine security clearance update for a senior government position entirely unrelated to his work. An anonymous, uncorroborated concern had been noted in his file, vaguely referencing his recent public confrontation and questioning his emotional stability under pressure. It was a classic smear, planted by unseen hands, designed to undermine him professionally, though it was quickly dismissed due to its baselessness and the overwhelming support from his superiors, including the president. It was a stark reminder of how far his opponents were willing to go. Agent Miller, loyal and incensed, brought him daily reports of online trolls, doctored images, and outright lies circulating on social media, all aimed at discrediting Washington. "They're trying to make you the villain, director," Miller said, his fists clenched. "I know, David," Washington replied, his gaze fixed on a cityscape that suddenly seemed less about opportunity and more about entrenched battles. "This isn't just about Hensley anymore. It's about whether a black man, regardless of his position, can ever truly receive unadulterated justice in this country when the assailant wears a badge." He realized that his initial plan to move forward, to focus on policy and reform, had to be broadened. The system wasn't just passively resisting. It was actively fighting back, using its ingrained biases and procedural loopholes to protect itself. His past had taught him endurance in the face of overt aggression. His present was teaching him about the tenacious, insidious nature of systemic exploitation, where the fight for justice was not a sprint, but a grueling marathon through a landscape designed to wear down even the most powerful. The humiliation on the street had been acute and public. The discrimination he now faced was quieter, more insidious, but in many ways, far more dangerous because it was woven into the very fabric of the institutions he served. The tension wasn't just about a court case, it was about the soul of the justice system itself. Weeks bled into months. The initial firestorm of media attention surrounding Director Washington's assault had, as predicted by the cynics, begun to dwindle, replaced by newer outrages and the relentless churn of the news cycle. Officer Hensley was out on bail, his trial date repeatedly postponed due to a barrage of defense motions. The narrative his legal team and the police union were peddling, that of a dedicated officer making a split-second judgment call under stress, now being unfairly persecuted, was gaining traction in certain echo chambers online and on talk radio. The Department of Justice's investigation into Hensley was proceeding, but with a maddening bureaucratic slowness that Washington found increasingly intolerable. The subtle pressures for him to remain above the fray, to let the system work, continued. Jamal Washington, however, was not a man to be idly managed or silenced. The memory of the cold steel against his skull, the echoes of past humiliations, and the present insidious campaign to discredit him had coalesced into a steely resolve. He had endured, he had observed the system's counterattack, and now he was preparing to act. He understood that true resistance wasn't just about weathering the storm, it was about redirecting its force. The turning point came not from a high-level informant or a dramatic FBI raid, but from an unexpected, anonymous source. Late one evening, a plain, unmarked envelope landed on Agent Miller's desk, having been couriered through a discreet channel that bypassed official FBI mail screening. Inside was a flash drive and a single. Type note: Officer Hensley is not an anomaly. He is a symptom. Records room. Conscience. Miller, following strict protocol for unsolicited material, immediately brought it to Washington, in a secure room, with cybersecurity experts on hand. They accessed the contents of the drive. It contained scanned copies of nearly a dozen internal affairs complaints filed against Officer Craig Hensley over the past decade. Most were from Black and Latino individuals, alleging unwarranted stops, verbal abuse, harassment, and excessive force. Each complaint had been investigated superficially, if at all, and subsequently dismissed as unfounded, unsubstantiated, or within departmental guidelines. Crucially, the files also contained internal memos and email snippets where supervisors had clearly downplayed or actively buried these complaints, often with cynical remarks about the complainants. This was dynamite. It was the pattern, the history of unchecked misconduct that Hensley's defenders and the police union had vehemently denied existed. It painted a picture not of a single regrettable incident, but of a sustained campaign of abuse by Hensley, enabled by a system that looked the other way, the anonymous sender. Likely a clerk or a low-level employee within Hensley's own police department, someone with access and a suddenly awakened conscience, had taken an immense personal risk. This, Washington said, his voice quiet but intense, holding up the flash drive. This is what they're terrified of. Not just Hensley's conviction, but the unraveling of the entire rotten culture that protected him. Agent Miller nodded grimly. This blows their good officer under stress narrative out of the water. What are your orders? Director Washington's first instinct was to hand it directly to the DOJ's Civil Rights Division. It was the proper official channel. He instructed Miller to make copies and prepare a formal submission. Yet, a part of him, forged in the fires of past disillusionment in witnessing the current foot-dragging, hesitated. Would this new evidence simply get absorbed into the slow grind of the existing investigation, its impact diluted by procedural delays and internal politics? The pressure to not inflame tensions could very well lead to this damning evidence being handled with kid gloves, perhaps used merely to secure a plea bargain for Hensley that avoided a wider inquiry into the department. This was where his resistance would truly begin. He would not allow this gift, delivered at great personal risk by an unknown ally, to be neutered. He called Chief Marcus Thorne. Chief, Washington's tone was polite, but with an underlying edge of iron. I have come into possession of some deeply disturbing information regarding Officer Hensley's service record. Information that suggests a clear and undeniable pattern of misconduct, specifically targeting minorities. That was repeatedly ignored by his superiors within your department. There was a moment of silence on the other end of the line. Director, Thorne finally said, his voice carefully neutral. Any such information should, of course, be forwarded to the ongoing DOJ investigation. We are cooperating fully. I am doing that, Chief Thorne, Washington replied, but I am also informing you directly, as the leader of your department, that this information indicates a systemic failure, not just the actions of one officer. I expect you to initiate a rigorous internal investigation into how these prior complaints were handled, or rather, mishandled. The public, and indeed my office, will be watching very closely to see if your department is capable of policing itself. It was a direct challenge, a refusal to let Thorne offload all responsibility to the DOJ. Washington was leveraging his position, not just as a victim, but as the head of the nation's premier law enforcement agency, to demand accountability from a local department. Next, he convened a discreet meeting with a select group of his most trusted senior legal advisors within the FBI. He didn't want this information buried, nor did he want it to be seen as the FBI improperly interfering in a local or DOJ matter. He needed a strategy. The DOJ has the primary jurisdiction for prosecution and the pattern or practice investigation. He told them, we will provide them with everything we have. However, we also have a responsibility to ensure that federal civil rights are protected. If this evidence indicates a broader conspiracy to deprive citizens of their rights under color of law within that department, we need to be prepared to support the DOJ with more resources, or even open our own preliminary inquiry if theirs proves insufficient. This was a significant escalation. It was Washington signaling that the FBI wouldn't just be a passive witness. His team began to quietly explore legal avenues and precedents for a more active federal role if the local and DOJ responses were inadequate, his most crucial act of resistance. however, was a calculated risk. He knew the anonymous source had likely risked their career, possibly more, to get this information out. He also knew that the surest way to ensure this evidence saw the light of day and had maximum impact was to bypass the filters of official channels that might seek to dilute or delay it. Washington contacted a veteran investigative journalist, a woman named Sarah Jennings, known for her relentless pursuit of truth and her impeccable ethical standards. He had crossed paths with her before, respected her work. He didn't leak the documents themselves. That would be a step too far, potentially compromising the DOJ case and the anonymous source. Instead, he spoke to her off the record, guiding her with carefully phrased questions and pointing her toward the types of records that might exist concerning officers with repeated, dismissed complaints in that specific police department. He suggested that a thorough examination of public records requests, if persistently pursued, might yield interesting patterns. If a department has a history of bearing complaints against certain officers, Sarah, Washington said, his voice measured, it raises questions not just about those officers, but about the integrity of the department's leadership and internal affairs processes. It's a matter of profound public interest. Wouldn't you agree, Jennings, a seasoned professional, understood the subtext? She knew the director of the FBI didn't make such calls idly. Her journalistic instincts flared. She didn't need the leaked documents directly from him. She needed the roadmap, the confirmation that such a trail likely existed. Within days, Jennings and her team launched a deep dive investigation, filing aggressive Freedom of Information Act requests, interviewing former officers, and connecting with civil rights attorneys who had long suspected such patterns. The anonymous leak to Washington had acted as a catalyst, empowering him to resist the pressure to stay silent and, in turn, to subtly empower the press to do its job. This was Washington's first true counteroffensive. He wasn't just defending himself, he was taking the fight to the systemic issues that allowed men like Hensley to flourish. He used the unexpected gift from a faceless ally not as a hidden weapon, but as a key to unlock other avenues of pressure and investigation. The ground was shifting. He had endured their attacks, and now he was beginning to methodically dismantle their defenses, aided by the courage of a single, unknown individual who believed in something more than silence. The tension was no longer solely on him. It was being reflected back onto the system itself. Sarah Jennings was a force of nature when given assent. Director Washington's carefully worded guidance had been enough to ignite her investigative instincts. For weeks, she and her team at the National Herald newspaper dug relentlessly. They battled bureaucratic stonewalling from the city police department regarding their Freedom of Information Act FOIA requests, appealed denials, and cross-referenced names and dates from the vague clues Washington had provided with what little public information was available. They interviewed frustrated civil rights lawyers, former disgruntled police officers, and, with great sensitivity and difficulty, some of the individuals whose complaints against Officer Hensley and other officers had been systematically buried. The breakthrough came when a recently retired internal affairs detective, disillusioned with the corruption and cronyism he had witnessed, decided to speak to Jennings, albeit anonymously at first. He corroborated the existence of the disappeared complaints against Hensley and several other officers in his precinct, explaining the informal system used to flag and bury complaints deemed problematic for the department's image or for favored officers. He even provided Jennings with non-specific details about the types of incidents in the general timeframe, which perfectly matched the data Washington had received from his anonymous source. Armed with this corroboration and the mounting pressure from Jennings's persistent FOIA lawsuits, the city slowly, grudgingly, began to release heavily redacted documents. But Jennings's team were experts at piecing together mosaics from fragments. The patterns started to emerge, stark and undeniable. The National Herald published Jennings's expose on a Sunday. A massive front-page story complete with statistical analyses, anonymized but powerful victim testimonies, and quotes from legal experts. The headline blared, "Shield of Silence: How One City Police Department buried a decade of abuse complaints against problem officers, including officer facing FBI director assault charges. The article didn't explicitly mention Director Washington's leak. It stood on its own as a monumental piece of investigative journalism, but its timing and focus were unmistakable. The public reaction was immediate and explosive. The initial shock of the assault on Washington had faded for some, but this investigation, laying bare a systemic rot, reignited public fury and broadened it significantly. It wasn't just about one bad apple cop anymore. It was about the whole orchard. Protests, which had died down, reignited with new vigor outside City Hall and the police headquarters, demanding Chief Thorne's resignation and a full, independent federal takeover of the investigation into the police department's practices. The timing of the article's publication was not entirely coincidental. Hensley's trial was, after numerous delays, finally scheduled to begin the following week. His defense attorney had been building a case around Hensley as a misunderstood hero. Jennings's article, and the mountain of evidence it alluded to, ripped that narrative to shreds just days before jury selection was set to commence. The public confrontation that flipped the power dynamic occurred not in a physical street, but in the court of public opinion and, subsequently, in the actual courtroom. The release of Jennings's story was the first salvo, the second, and more direct. Confrontation involved Director Washington himself. Despite the subtle pressures to remain in the background, Washington announced he would be attending a pretrial hearing for Hensley, not as the FBI director in an official capacity, but as the victim and a witness. His presence alone was a statement. When he walked into the packed courtroom, a hush fell. Hensley, seated at the defense table, visibly paled, his usual swagger gone. The rows of uniformed officers present in a show of solidarity for Hensley looked distinctly uncomfortable. The power in the room had subtly shifted. Washington was no longer just a name in a file. He was there, a formidable, composed presence, the living embodiment of the abuse Hensley was accused of. During the hearing, which concerned the admissibility of Agent Miller's recording and the newly surfaced evidence of prior complaints, Hensley's lawyer fought ferociously. He argued that Jennings's article was prejudicial, a deliberate attempt to poison the jury pool, and that the past complaints were irrelevant to this specific charge. The prosecutor, armed with the information from Washington's anonymous source, now officially submitted to the DOJ and shared with the prosecution and bolstered by the public outcry from Jennings's article, argued powerfully that the prior complaints demonstrated a clear pattern of behavior, intent, and modus operandi, directly refuting the defense's claim of an isolated incident or a justifiable mistake. Then came the critical moment. The judge, a stern, no-nonsense woman named Esther Carmichael, who had read Jennings's article and the prosecution's extensive briefs, made her ruling. Regarding the audio evidence from Special Agent Miller, Judge Carmichael declared, her voice ringing through the courtroom, this court finds it was lawfully obtained under exigent circumstances by a federal officer witnessing a felony assault and is therefore admissible. Regarding the evidence of prior complaints against Officer Hensley, while this court acknowledges the potential for prejudice, it also recognizes the significant probative value in establishing a pattern of conduct, particularly given the defense's anticipated arguments. Therefore, a limited selection of these prior complaints, specifically those demonstrating similar alleged behaviors of unwarranted aggression and racial bias, will be admissible under Rule 404B. A gasp went through the courtroom. Hensley slumped in his chair. His lawyer's face was a mask of fury and disbelief. This ruling was a devastating blow to their entire defense strategy. The shield of silence had been pierced. Witnesses, in the form of the victims from those prior complaints, many of whom had been found and encouraged to come forward by Jennings's investigation and by community activists emboldened by the new developments, were now prepared to testify. Their stories, once dismissed and buried, would finally be heard in a court of law. The undeniable evidence, Miller's recording, the meticulously documented prior complaints, and now the prospect of live testimony from other victims, created an insurmountable obstacle for Hensley's defense. The power dynamic had not just flipped, it had been completely upended. Officer Hensley, once the arrogant enforcer on the street, was now a cornered defendant facing a mountain of damning evidence and public condemnation. Director Washington, the initial victim of a humiliating public assault, had, through strategic resistance and the unexpected aid of an anonymous whistleblower and a tenacious journalist, become the catalyst for exposing a much larger systemic injustice. He had endured, resisted, and then, with undeniable evidence and in a public forum, turned the tables. The city's leadership, including Chief Thorne, was now under intense scrutiny, with federal investigators openly expanding their probe into the police department's systemic issues, a direct result of the pressure cooker Washington and Jennings had created. The trial itself, when it finally began, felt almost like an epilogue to this public confrontation. The outcome was no longer seriously in doubt. The fight for this specific conviction was largely won, but the larger battle against the system that protected officers like Hensley had just entered a new, more hopeful phase. All because the truth, backed by irrefutable evidence and courageous witnesses, had finally been dragged into the light. The trial of Officer Craig Hensley was shorter than anyone anticipated, faced with the admissible audio recording of him threatening Director Washington. The director's own powerful and composed testimony detailing the unprovoked aggression and racial slurs, Special Agent Miller's corroborating account, and the damning testimonies of 3 other citizens who had previously suffered similar abuse at Hensley's hands their old. Buried complaints now resurrected as vital evidence, the defense crumbled. Hensley's lawyer attempted to paint his client as a victim of political pressure and media hysteria. But the evidence was too overwhelming, the pattern too clear. The jury, a diverse panel that had listened intently to every piece of testimony, deliberated for less than 6 hours before returning a unanimous verdict: guilty on all counts, aggravated assault with a deadly weapon, and official misconduct. A wave of emotions swept through the courtroom. There were quiet sobs of relief from the families of Hensley's past victims, a steely nod of satisfaction from Director Washington, and a stunned, ashen look on Hensley's face as his bail was immediately revoked, and he was led away in handcuffs. This time not by his colleagues, but by court bailiffs. Justice, in this specific instance, had been served, decisively and publicly. The sentencing came a few weeks later. Judge Carmichael, citing Hensley's egregious abuse of power, his lack of remorse, and the profound breach of public trust, handed down a sentence that sent shockwaves through law enforcement communities nationwide: 10 years in state prison. With no possibility of early parole for the first 7, it was a sentence that acknowledged not just the assault on one high-profile individual, but the years of terror Hensley had inflicted on less powerful members of the community. The community's reaction was multifaceted. For many, especially within minority communities, it was a moment of profound, almost cathartic validation. Protests turned into celebrations. Vigils became rallies of hope. The conviction and significant sentence were seen as a crack in Mao's blue wall of silence, a sign that accountability, even for police officers, was possible. Jamal Washington became an unintentional symbol, not just of surviving an injustice, but of fighting back against a corrupt system and winning. His image was no longer solely that of the FBI director. He was now a figurehead for a burgeoning movement demanding broader police reform. Chief Marcus Thorne, under immense pressure from the ongoing Doge pattern or practice investigation that had been supercharged by Jennings's expose and the Hensley trial revelations, tendered his resignation. His departure signaled the beginning of a painful but necessary overhaul of the city's police department. The anonymous whistleblower who had provided the initial flash drive to Washington eventually came forward, not publicly, but to Sarah Jennings, who protected their identity fiercely. It turned out to be a young civilian data entry clerk in the records room, who, after witnessing Washington's assault on the news and wrestling with her conscience over the suppressed files she regularly saw, decided she could no longer remain complicit. Her courage, though quiet and initially hidden, had been the spark that lit the fuse. The Department of Justice, armed with the evidence unearthed during the Hensley investigation and trial, as well as Jennings's continued reporting, eventually filed a sweeping lawsuit against the city's police department, leading to a federally mandated consent decree. This decree enforced sweeping reforms, improved training on use of force and de-escalation, robust systems for tracking and investigating civilian complaints, community oversight boards with real power, and initiatives to recruit a more diverse police force. The road to actual, lasting change would be long and arduous, but the first, critical steps had been taken. For Jamal Washington, life did not simply return to normal. The experience had changed him, deepened his resolve. He used his platform not to dwell on his personal ordeal, but to advocate for the systemic reforms now underway in that city and to push for similar changes nationwide. He became a more vocal proponent of community policing initiatives, of national standards for police conduct, and of robust civilian oversight. He directed the FBI to expand its resources dedicated to investigating civil rights violations by law enforcement and to develop best practice training modules to share with state and local agencies. There were still detractors. Of course, those who saw him as a divisive figure, who resented the changes being forced upon police departments, but their voices were increasingly drowned out by a growing chorus demanding accountability and reform. The narrative had shifted. The question, if this can happen to him, what about ordinary citizens, had been answered with a resounding, it happens too often, and it must stop. Months later, Director Washington returned to the city where he had been assaulted. Not for a confrontation, but to attend the first graduation ceremony of a new class of police recruits trained under the reformed curriculum mandated by the consent decree. He was invited to speak, standing before the young officers, men and women of all races and backgrounds. He didn't recount his own trauma. Instead, he spoke of the immense responsibility they were undertaking, the sanctity of the oath they were about to swear, and the profound importance of treating every single member of the community with dignity and respect. The badge you will wear, Washington said, his voice resonating with hard-won wisdom, is not a shield for misconduct, nor a license for prejudice. It is a symbol of public trust, a trust that must be earned every day, on every call, in every interaction. The power you will wield is immense, but it is nothing compared to the power of justice rightly applied, of compassion genuinely offered, of a community served with integrity. As he looked out at their faces, he saw not the cynicism of Hensley, but the cautious hope of a new generation. The fight was far from over, the system far from perfect, but in the conviction of one officer, in the awakening of a community, in the courage of a whistleblower, and in the relentless pursuit of truth by a dedicated journalist. A significant victory had been won. Jamal Washington, the FBI director who had been held at gunpoint, had become more than a victim or a survivor. He had become an agent of change, a testament to the fact that even the most entrenched systems of injustice could be challenged, and sometimes even bent towards the arc of justice. His ordeal had sparked a public confrontation that led not to further division, but to a difficult, yet ultimately inspiring, process of reckoning and reform. The echoes of that single, violent encounter on a city street were now reverberating as calls for a more just and equitable future.